Imagine opening a family album, sepia tones, stiff clothing, dead expressions frozen in time. One photograph in particular, a wealthy couple from 1904 standing beside their maid. At first glance, nothing unusual. Until you notice their hands. The master's right hand is not resting against his cane but curled inside the maid's palm, like a child gripping its mother. The wife's fingers stretch outward, not toward her husband, but fusing into the maid's other hand, as though three bodies were tethered by something unholy. This was no photographic error. Every attempt to retouch, restore, or even burn this image only made the detail sharper. Historians dismiss it, families hide it, but behind that photograph lies a story too disturbing to enter polite history. Tonight, we are opening the door. Records show the couple as Edward and Catherine Albridge of Hartford, Connecticut. Heirs to shipping wealth, church benefactors, respected pillars of society. Their maid, however, was never listed by name. On censuses, she is only recorded as house servant, female, 24. Diaries from guests describe her as quiet, pale, and far too obedient. She never spoke unless directly ordered, but photographs and testimonies suggest something uncanny. Her eyes always followed children in the household, never the adults. Neighbors whispered that she arrived from an orphanage upstate, but not a single orphanage has claimed her records. The Albridges themselves destroyed letters, payroll accounts, and household inventories between 1902 and 1905. It is as if someone had reason to erase her completely, except for that one photograph. The image was rediscovered in 1961 during the demolition of the Albridge estate. A shoebox of family portraits was uncovered, but this one photo had been wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath floorboards away from all others. A demolition worker kept it, believing it to be worth something. He later claimed his wife couldn't sleep with it in the house. She said the hands move if you stare too long. By the 1970s, the photo circulated in underground occult circles, often appearing in newsletters about parasitic lineages and bonded servants. Its trail vanishes in 1982 when a professor of divinity at Yale reportedly purchased it for private research. That professor resigned suddenly in 1983 and never spoke publicly again. The photo hasn't surfaced since. What we're left with are accounts, rumors, and one family's rotting silence. To understand the Albridge photograph, we must return to Hartford at the turn of the century, a city of industry, rising banks, insurance dynasties. Immigrant labor fueled fortunes, but behind the marble facades were tenements and orphan asylums overflowing with children no one wanted. Orphanages were supposed to be charitable institutions, but many served as warehouses where the unwanted were trained to be domestics shipped to wealthy households with little oversight. The maid in the photo, whoever she was, fits this pattern, only here the arrangement seems to have been something darker. Families could request children with particular qualities: docility, silence, physical sturdiness. In whispered records, a word recurs: bonded, a term no state ledger explains, but one Hartford priest described privately as children bound in more ways than law. Edward Albridge had a reputation for philanthropy. He donated generously to the church, funded orphanage expansions, and financed a wing of Hartford Hospital. Yet, every donation coincided with rumors, sudden disappearances of orphans, missing financial ledgers, unexplained changes in orphanage staff. Catherine Albridge was known for charity teas, where young girls from orphanages would serve. Guests later remarked that Catherine insisted they not be spoken to. Servants described a peculiar ritual in the household. The family dined with their maid standing directly behind their chairs, hands placed on their shoulders for the entirety of the meal. Visitors reported this as unnerving, but brushed it off as eccentricity. Today it reads like something else, something that bound the Albridges to their servant in ways polite society could not admit. Digging deeper, we find that the Albridges' maid likely came from the St. Helena Orphan Asylum, an institution plagued by scandal. Between 1895 and 1907, St. Helena lost track of over 60 children placed in homes. No explanations, no follow-up. In one letter preserved by a local parish, a priest warned, "The children are given not as gifts, but as burdens. What attaches to them is not meant to be broken." That phrase, "what attaches," suggests something more than labor contracts. perhaps spiritual, perhaps parasitic. Rumors claim children from St. Helena were taught strange prayers before being sent away. Not catechism, not scripture, but words that unsettled even the staff. Could the maid in the Albridge photograph have been one of them? If so, her role in the household was not merely domestic. Among the Albridge's visitors was a Connecticut senator who later wrote in his journal about an evening dinner in 1904. He described the maid as standing too close, almost entwined, her hands on them as if to steady herself. But the senator then adds a disturbing detail. When the lights dimmed after supper, I could not tell whose hand was whose. Others described Catherine Albridge as looking younger. After the maid entered their service, her skin smoother, her eyes less tired. A visiting cousin remarked that Edward seemed more vigorous, as though fed by her presence. Were the maid's hands a source of strength? Was she giving something, or taking it away? Guests laughed it off. But the photograph doesn't laugh, it shows the truth, a connection not natural, not chosen, but fused. By 1905, the maid vanishes from all records. No death certificate, no marriage, no further census entries. Household ledgers skip a year. Catherine stops hosting her charity teas. Guests stop visiting. The Albridges grow increasingly reclusive. Edward resigns from his civic boards. Catherine is seen only at church, always wearing gloves, even in summer. In 1906, one neighbor swears she saw Catherine walking in the garden at night, holding someone's hand, though no one was beside her. Was the maid dismissed? Dead? Or had she been absorbed into the household in ways that make no sense on paper, but perfect sense in nightmares? The photograph is the last trace. It may not just be an image of the past, but a record of the exact moment the bond could no longer be hidden. Hidden in probate archives is a reference to a ward of the Albridges around 1904. The child is unnamed, referred to only as adopted for care. No further records exist. But the maid's constant attention toward children begins to make sense. Some believe she herself had been bound to carry something from one generation to another. A carrier? As whispered in occult notes tied to the case, a silent child erased from records may have been the intended vessel. If so, the photograph is not a family portrait, but documentation of a transfer, an old ritual encoded in the hands of 3 adults, with a child just out of frame. The Albridges were lifelong benefactors of St. Matthias Episcopal Church. Yet strangely, after 1904, the Albridge name is omitted from parish newsletters. One priest's private diary makes a chilling reference: their house servant. What she carries cannot be confessed, cannot be absolved. We must not allow her touch. This suggests that the church knew more than it admitted. Why then accept their donations for years? Why allow orphanage transfers to their household? The likely answer: because institutions thrive on silence. If an orphan carried something, trauma, curse, contagion of belief, it was easier to place her in the home of the wealthy than confront the truth. Hartford's power was built not just on industry, but on suppression. Hands recur again and again in the Albridge story. The maid's hands binding husband and wife, hands resting on shoulders during meals. Hands written about in private journals. In folklore, hands symbolize inheritance, blessing, touch of healing, or of curse. Some historians believe the orphanages used children's hands in symbolic rituals, imprinting obedience by forcing them to grip objects, crosses, or even each other until blood pooled. By the time they entered service, the gesture was automatic: binding, fusing, attaching. Perhaps the maid in the photograph was the perfected result of this process. Her hands were not her own. They were instruments of attachment. The Albridges didn't employ her. They surrendered to her. In 1907, Hartford physicians recorded a series of strange cases. Patients claiming phantom touch. Sensations of being held by invisible hands. Some belonged to servants recently dismissed from wealthy homes. One doctor theorized shared hysteria. Another called it ritual trauma manifesting somatically. But one report mentions the Albridges by name. Catherine had visited a physician, refusing to remove her gloves, claiming her skin ached with another's grip. The doctor noted bruising around her wrists, as though someone were holding them constantly. Yet no one else lived in the household at that time. The maid was gone, or perhaps she never left at all. By 1910, the Albridges were shadows of themselves. Edward died suddenly of what was recorded as cardiac failure, though no autopsy was performed. Catherine withdrew entirely, shuttering the estate. A cousin who visited described the home as suffocating, as if air itself had weight. Catherine reportedly spoke of hearing her footsteps still. She died in 1913, her body discovered with her hands crossed, but fingers grotesquely twisted inward. The death certificate simply states natural causes. Servants refused to dress her body for burial. They claimed she was still clutching something, though nothing was visible. After Catherine's death, the estate was stripped of records. The church refused to hold her funeral. Orphanage ledgers from the St. Helena Asylum were suddenly misplaced. State census gaps widened. It is clear someone, or some institution, worked deliberately to erase the maid, the photograph, and the bond. But erasure leaves scars. Local children continue to whisper about the woman who holds you when you sleep. Families near the estate reported waking to find their children sleepwalking toward the old house, hands outstretched. The photograph was buried, but the gesture survived. When the photograph resurfaced in 1982, it was purchased by a professor of divinity at Yale. His research notes, leaked after his resignation, described the image as not a photo, but a document of transfer. He claimed the hands were evidence of an orphan lineage designed to carry collective sins, siphoning decay from families of prominence. According to him, the maid was not a servant, but an inheritance ritual embodied. His notes stop abruptly, replaced by a single sentence scrawled in red ink. She does not stop holding. He never taught again. What was the maid? A victim of ritual abuse trained from childhood. A vessel for something older than Christianity, hidden in the guise of charity. Some folklorists argue she represents the survival of gripe, rites, ancient practices where touch past burdens, illnesses, or ancestral sins. Others believe she was no more than a traumatized orphan whose silence and touch unsettled guests. But the photograph remains, and it refuses easy explanation. When shown to experts in the 1970s, one remarked, "If this is a fake, it is a fake that knows too much." Every account of the photograph suggests it changes those who see it. A demolition worker's wife claimed to hear hands scratching at the walls. An occultist claimed the photo caused his own hands to cramp until his bones cracked. A Yale student who allegedly saw it in 1982 was later institutionalized, repeating, "She's holding me still." Unlike most haunted objects, the photograph does not show death. It shows attachment. The terror is not violence, but fusion. The idea that once you are touched, you are never entirely yourself again. Look at modern Hartford and you'll find echoes. Families still pass down unspoken rituals, still avoid speaking of certain orphanages. Photographs from other estates occasionally surface, always with servants positioned strangely close, hands overlapping in unnatural ways. Perhaps the Albridge photograph is not unique. Perhaps it is the only one that survived the fire, the flood, the institutional shredders. If so, the question becomes horrifying. How many families were bonded this way? How many households held a servant whose name was never recorded, but whose hands were everywhere? Imagine your own family photographs. Stiff poses, children fidgeting, adults grimacing. Look closely. Who stands behind the central figures, whose hands rest just a little too firmly? What if every family of prominence carried one? An unnamed figure absorbing, tethering, transferring what the family could not admit. The Albridge photograph is terrifying not because it is unique, but because it suggests a pattern, and patterns once glimpsed cannot be unseen. Once you know to look for the hands, you see them everywhere. The Albridge estate is gone, the maid's name erased, the photograph hidden or destroyed or still waiting in some locked drawer at Yale, but the story cannot be buried. It is not about one family, one orphan, one cursed photograph. It is about the machinery of silence that allowed institutions to bury the truth. The truth that orphans were not merely servants but vessels. That families bound themselves to something unnatural in the guise of charity. And that even now the gesture remains, hands clutching hands, never letting go. Perhaps that is why the photo was wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath floorboards, not because it showed something that happened, but because it showed something that still happens. Something you cannot unsee, something that, once it grips you, does not let go.